Okay, this is Lex at MacsFuture.com and welcome to the Apple Podcast. Today is July 29th, 2011, and there's a lot of interesting Apple news to discuss, so let's get to it. Okay, let's talk about the big news, and it's big news in Apple world, but it's also big news for me. So a couple of days ago, I bit the bullet and I went out and bought the brand new MacBook Air. I bought the 11-inch MacBook Air. And, let me tell you about my experience. Well, I'm kind of thrilled. Let me first tell you why I decided to get it. I already have a 2010 27-inch iMac, the quad-core i7, so I have a pretty powerful Mac. But I decided to get the MacBook Air, even though I have an iPad 2. So now I have an iPad 2, a MacBook Air, and a 27-inch iMac. And why did I get it? Well, I love my iPad 2. I mean, I do a lot of things with it. I take it with me everywhere. But one thing is that there are some things I can do on a Mac that I can't do on the iPad 2. And I like to have the mobility. And I guess the one thing that I really like to do that's more high-end is record and edit this video podcast, which involves screen recording, which involves editing. And I can do a lot on the iPad, but I have much more mobility with the MacBook Air. For example, I through jailbreaking, I can screen record on the iPad 2, but currently the jailbreak app Display Recorder does not allow you to record audio at the same time. And the beauty of screen recording on the Mac is, I use Camtasia, and there's also ScreenFlow, two apps that allow screen recording. So I just like to have the mobility to be able to produce this podcast remotely and not always tethered to my iMac. And my iPad and iPhone really do a lot in that regard, but it's, in the end, I would have to bring back the iPad or iPhone to my iMac to get the editing done. And it's not just the video editing and the screen recording, it's also the audio processing. While I can record audio on my iPad using my Samsung microphone to my iPad, I can't really edit it as easily as if I then take that audio file and into my Mac. Because what I do on my Mac is first I use Levelator to normalize it so that all the audio is at the same level. And then I import it into GarageBand and convert the AAC part of the audio podcast into MP3 and then upload it to Posterous. That's where the audio version of my podcast goes up and is hosted. And so it just gives me more flexibility to have a mobile computer. And I've been eyeing the MacBook Air for quite some time. This is the third generation MacBook Air. And, I have been consistently podcasting every week. This is episode, 82 or 83 of the Apple podcast. And I'm up to well over a year in the iPad podcast, and so I've been sticking to it. And so I thought, I will use the MacBook Air, and it'll just give me more freedom. My iMac is in my bedroom, and it's a pretty big device and very powerful and great. But, I have a family, and sometimes I need to be in a different room or somewhere else. And sometimes we go on trips, and sometimes, we do other stuff. And it's good to have the mobility. And look, I think one day the iPad will completely replace the MacBook Air. And the iPad's getting more and more powerful, but the MacBook Air still gives you a little bit of, processor power and flexibility that you don't have with the iPad. But the iPad's very closely getting there. So anyways, let's go on to another part of the MacBook Air experience. Okay, so which MacBook Air did I get? And, there's a variety of them. And there's basically two models. There's the 11-inch MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Air. And I decided to get the 11-inch MacBook Air. And the stock models for the 11-inch MacBook Air this year come in two sizes. There's the base model at $999 with 64 gigabyte worth of storage. Comes with a 1.6 gigahertz dual-core Intel Core i7 processor, 2 gigs of memory. But for only $200 more, you can get the same processor, but with 4 gigs of memory and double the size of the SSD flash storage, so 128 gigabytes of storage and 4 gigabytes of memory. So I figured it was worth getting that. Now, why didn't I go for the 13-inch MacBook Air? I didn't go for the 13-inch MacBook Air because I really wanted the hyper portability of the 11-inch one. Now, I already have a massive Macintosh, the iMac 27-inch at home. So I'm in a situation where I have two Macs, and my thinking was, look, have a base station Mac, which is this massive 27-inch iMac, but then have hyper portability. So I have hyper portability with the iPad and with the 11-inch iMac. And, you know, it does make a difference. For example, the weight of the 11-inch is, you know, somewhat lighter than the 13-inch. The 13-inch weighs just about 3 pounds. It's at 2.96 pounds, while the other one, the 11-inch, is at 2.38 pounds. And one thing I learned with the iPad is that weight can make a real difference. We're going through a mobility revolution right now, where things like the iPhone and the iPad make computing hypermobile. And the more mobile you are with computing, the more interesting the computing can get, because you can do all sorts of things when you can move around with it. Now, that's why I decided, look, I have the big iMac. What I'm looking for is mobile computing. And so the 11-inch, you know, at 2.38 pounds is somewhat lighter than the 13-inch at 2.96. And believe me, that weight can make a difference. When you carry something around, the lighter it is, the more likely you're going to carry it around. But if you don't have, you know, another computer, and if you don't plan to have two computers, I would suggest getting maybe the 13-inch MacBook Air, just because you'll have a bigger screen. Unless you do something else, which is you could get the 11-inch MacBook Air and buy Apple's new Thunderbolt display, which is a big 27-inch display. And sort of then, when you're at home, you hook up your MacBook Air to that display, and when you're on the road, you disconnect it. All you need is one cable, and you're all set to go. So, you know, it's a really cool computer, and I think you're going to greatly enjoy it. Now, the main reason I was excited to get the MacBook Air is because it has an SSD drive in it. And the MacBook Air comes standard with an SSD drive, and you can't get a regular hard drive with it. And people have been raving about how that can really make a difference in your Mac computing experience. And so what is an SSD drive? If you're not familiar with it, an SSD drive is essentially a flash drive. You know, that's the same sort of drive that you get in those little cards that you put in your camera. And they're very fast and they're solid state, so there's no moving parts. But they're expensive per gigabyte. So, for example, you know, it would have cost another $300 to increase and customize my MacBook Air to go from 128 gigabytes to, you know, 250. So for that doubling of, you know, gigabytes, it would be another $300. Now you can get a MacBook Pro with like 500 gigabytes standard. So you give up storage on your MacBook Air, you know, compared to getting a MacBook Pro or an iMac with regular hard drives in it. Because with a regular iMac with hard drives in there, you could put in a 2 terabyte hard drive. But the difference is you get a lot faster computing. And why do you get faster computing? How does that make sense? Because the MacBook Air has a 1.6 gigahertz i5 processor, which is less gigahertz than the 2.7 gigahertz quad-core processor that I have in my iMac, but it's still very zippy. And the secret is these SSD drives can read and write to the drive much quicker than a regular drive. So if you're looking at the video podcast here, I used a program that tests the read-write speeds of the SSD drive on my MacBook Air. And if you look here, the test was done, writing different size files from, I guess, very small amounts to large amounts. And the key thing is that the read-write time almost across the board is between 228 megabytes per second to 254 megabytes per second. So that's pretty fast. And to give you a sense of how fast, my internal hard drive for my iMac, the read-write speed is 80 megabytes per second. So that is, let's see, it's 3 times faster in reading and writing to the hard drive than a regular conventional drive. And that 3 times reading and writing makes programs much zippier than on a computer with a regular hard drive. And this is only going to increase because there are now SSD drives that read and write at 500 or 600 megabytes per second. So, and that's really a lot of where the bottleneck had been in computing. So this is one of the reasons I got the MacBook Air, is just to have this much zippier computing experience and try out the SSD drive. And frankly, one of my goals is to swap out or add in a second drive into my iMac, which is also an SSD drive, and to get that kind of speed on my iMac, because it really does make a difference. So, that's one main reason to get the MacBook Air, is to have this faster SSD drive. Now, as GigaOm reports on July 27th, 2011, it's only a matter of time before the MacBook Air takes over Apple's entire line of portable Macintoshes. And there's 2 stories out, as GigaOm reports, on MacRumors.com and TUAW.com, arrived this past Tuesday, claiming that Apple is now working on an ultra-thin 15-inch Mac notebook, and another report saying a 17-inch. And it totally makes sense because, the MacBook Air, the 13-inch and 11-inch, is beautiful. It's very thin, it's very stylish, and it has the SSD drives. And it also is missing a DVD drive. It has the Thunderbolt port and USB drives, USB ports. And it's really the future of computing, because once you go to, I think, one of these MacBook Airs, you can't imagine having, a 5-pound MacBook Pro. And, so I do think they're going to come out with a 15-inch MacBook Air. I guess it would weigh maybe 3.5 to 4 pounds, but it would have this sort of sleek, thin design, which I think people prize, and maybe even a 17-inch MacBook Air, which comes in under 5 pounds. That would be very cool. Now, I think the people who are going to complain are the hardcore pro users. They're going to complain about not having a DVD drive. I think the DVD drive is dead. It's totally, totally going away, because I don't think you need it. Between the internet and flash drives and all sorts of ways to transfer stuff, and movies that are streamed from Netflix and YouTube and Hulu, you don't really need a DVD drive. And it's kind of ironic that I got the MacBook Air this week, because I literally mailed my last DVD to Netflix. Netflix recently went to a model where they were going to charge the same amount of money a month, I think $7.95, to get 1 DVD per month, and also $7.95 to stream movies. And so they increased the price if you want to do both. What Netflix is doing is they're trying to steer people to just having movies streamed to them and not use the DVDs. So it's kind of ironic. this week I decided to, drop the DVD part of the Netflix experience and just go to streaming. And I mailed the last DVD to Netflix the same week that I got the MacBook Air, which I think it's poetic, because the MacBook Air does not have a DVD drive. Now, so I do think we're going to have MacBook Airs come out within the next 6 months that are 15 inches and 17 inches. So this clearly is the trend. Now, let me tell you some of the neat things and some not neat things about the MacBook Air and Lion. Now, I did have some troubles with Lion and the MacBook Air, and I had to do a little bit of troubleshooting. And my problem was this. I noticed that there were some apps that didn't work with Lion, in particularly apps that go into the sort of the root of the operating system or of the Mac. And I think with Lion, Apple is trying to keep users away from the sort of guts of the operating system, and also prevent third-party developers from getting into the guts of the operating system. So in particular, I had a problem with an app that I use to test the speed of the SSD drive, and I showed you a screenshot of that, and that is Quickbench. And here is the Quickbench app. Now, when I ran it a couple of days ago, it was actually my fault. I picked the hard drive, and it said error. It said it couldn't read write to it. In fact, it's this area. Sorry, you do not have sufficient permission to read and write to this drive. And I thought, that there was, some way to fix this, and so I changed the preferences for the whole hard drive, and that screwed things up. And I called Apple Care, and they were very responsive, Apple Care, and they basically, we did some things to fix it going into the terminal, but in the end, the guy from Apple said that I should install a new Lion operating system. And now here's the catch. It doesn't come, the MacBook Air, like the prior MacBook Air, with Lion already installed on a flash drive or a DVD. What you have to do is you have to restart your MacBook Air, and I guess this is only for the MacBook Air and new Macintoshes. You restart it, and as you're restarting, you press down Command R. And as you press Command R, it allows you to connect to the internet and download from Apple OS X Lion again and have it install. Now, when I tried this at home, it didn't work. I kept getting an error. In fact, the App Store wouldn't allow me to download any app on Lion. And in the end, what I did was launch Disk Utility and repair permissions again on the hard drive, and then I was able to have that restart of the computer and then download from Apple's site the Lion operating system. That worked, and what was nice about it, it kept all the apps that I had installed and my settings there. It didn't overwrite it. It just put a nice new clean version of Lion. But I'll tell you, I kind of miss having that kind of control, because what if my Wi-Fi connection was bad or my internet connection was bad, and what if I just was connected to the Apple Store and I couldn't get it done. I like having a disk or something there, and there is a workaround. You can download the app again from the App Store, and if you right-click on the app and show the package, you'll see within the package, you'll see an image, and that image is the image of the installer. Now the weird thing is, before I downloaded it from Apple the way I was supposed to, I tried all sorts of hacks to try to get it done. And one hack that I tried is on my 27-inch iMac, I had Lion, an image of it, and one of the great utilities now in Lion is the AirDrop. And if you're looking at the video here, AirDrop is built into the folder structure, into the Finder on the left side under Favorites. And what was really cool is that when I'm at home, my MacBook Air just recognizes the iMac, even if the iMac's not connected through a Wi-Fi network. And it's so cool because all I did was I dragged on my iMac the big almost 4 GB image of Lion, and it recognized this computer, and it worked. It was able to drag it in, so it was very cool. It worked very well, and so I think this is something we're going to have in the future in iOS. I mean, once we have iOS devices work with AirDrop, I think it's gonna be on every iPhone and iPad, because imagine if you have the iPhone and iPad and you're going to be able to transfer to a Mac without having a Wi-Fi network, just having Wi-Fi on. So, that's a very cool development. Now, one of the other tests that I ran on the MacBook Air that I got is the GeekBench test from Primate Labs. And if you want to run it in 32 bits, it's free. And it costs about $12 or $13 if you want to buy the license to run it in 64 bits. Now, 64 bits is going to be more powerful. And these MacBook Airs and Lion run in 64-bit, which is faster, more powerful crunching and computing. But to give you a sense of how fast my 11-inch MacBook Air, 1.6 gigahertz, is in terms of a GeekBench score, it scored around 4,500 in 32-bit mode. Now that's comparable to an iMac 3 gigahertz. It's actually faster than a late 2009 iMac with an Intel Core 2 Duo running at 3 gigahertz. And it's about the same processor power as an iMac late 2009 Core Duo at 3.33 gigahertz. My 2010 quad-core i7 iMac, gets close to 10,000. So what we're talking about here is processing power. But processing power isn't all computer experience, because it really doesn't capture how quick and fast the MacBook Air is. Look at this. I'll launch Pages, and let's just see how quickly it opens Pages. So boom, there we go. Pages is open. So it's very quick in that regard. You don't get a lot of hang time in opening apps. Let's see. I'll open QuickTime. Let's see what happens. QuickTime. Boom. Let's see. Is it open? Well, it's open. There's nothing there. Let's see about QuickTime. Anyways, it's much faster. So these are pretty substantial. To give you a sense of the GeekBench score, so 4,500 for this iMac, for this MacBook Air. The older MacBook Airs were getting around, I'd say 2,000 on the GeekBench score. So this is double as fast as let's see here, for example, the 13-inch MacBook Air from late 2010 scored 3,008. Let's go further back. MacBook Air. Wow, you go back down to the 2000s. Let's see, the original MacBook Air late 2008 scored only 2,425. So these are much more powerful. The 2000, I mean, we're much. Oh, look at this. The 11-inch late 2010 MacBook Air scored 2,024. So really, my current 11-inch MacBook Air is scoring 2.25 times more processor power than the MacBook Air, the 11-inch that came out last year, only 9 months ago. So these are much, much faster. Okay, so let's go to some other news. One of the more interesting things today, the 29th of July, is that Apple now has more cash than the United States government. As you know, the United States government is in sort of a crisis right now because Congress is sort of debating whether to allow the United States to go above the debt ceiling. And a really funny story came out from, I think it's Silicon Alley website, and basically they point out that, look, Apple now has $76.2 billion in the piggyback in terms of cash, short-term securities, and marketable long-term securities, which is really Apple's piggy bank. And apparently the United States Treasury, the government, has an operating cash balance of only $73.8 billion at the end of the day, the other day. So it's kind of ironic. The federal government's not being very successful right now, but Apple is more successful than even the federal government. Can you imagine? One company has more cash in the piggy bank than the federal government does. So that's both inspiring in the sense that Apple's inspiring and not so inspiring about the government. So, interesting twist. Now, if you upgrade to Lion, there's a little bit of an Easter egg in Lion. Particularly if you have an old computer. Now, if you recall in the olden days, when you would get Lion, just the operating system, you would just get Lion. You wouldn't get the iLife suite with Lion. The iLife suite being GarageBand, the latest version of iPhoto, the latest version of iMovie, and iWeb. Well, apparently, there's a story out, I guess, from, I think it's MacNN, that people have discovered that if you buy Lion, it gives you a free download of the 3 key latest versions in the iLife suite through the Mac App Store, and that is iMovie, iTunes, iPhoto, and GarageBand. You don't get iWeb because that's being really discontinued. So look, it's a real deal here to upgrade. So if Lion only costs $29, and so now for $29 you're not only getting a new operating system, but you're getting some of the latest and key components of the iLife suite. So there's really no reason to do it. Now the key though is you need to have, Lion won't work on old legacy Macintoshes. You have to have at least a dual a dual core 2, not the original single core Duo, but the dual core 2 Intel processor. So I have an old 20-inch iMac from January 2006 that won't be able to run Lion, but really anything running a Core Duo 2 processor and after will run Lion. Okay, so some other news that's exciting about Apple is that word has come out, I guess yesterday, the 28th of July, that Apple has now surpassed, it is #1 in selling smartphones in the world. And so it's the world's top smartphone vendor based on results from some company called IDC, and I guess this is MacRumors.com that reports this. So according to a survey, I guess in the second quarter of 2011, which is I guess that's the quarter ending, well, that's actually earlier this year. But anyways, Apple sold 20.3 million smartphones, iPhones, in that quarter. Now, a year before that, in the same quarter, Apple sold 8.4 smartphones. And Apple's ahead of Samsung, which is getting very close. Samsung came in at number 2 at 19.2 million. Now, Samsung zoomed, a year before was only selling 3.1 million. So the big winners are Apple and Samsung. And it's interesting because Apple's in a very vicious patent and intellectual property battle litigations all over the world with Samsung. And Samsung has been a supplier of parts for Apple. But the real loser is Nokia. In the smartphone world, it went from selling 23.8 million in a quarter a year before to down to 16.7 million. So it's pretty impressive. Apple's market share of the smartphone market is now 18.5%. So these are pretty staggering, percentages, I think. Look, I think it's only going to increase for Apple because Apple's going to come out with the iPhone 5, and it's selling even in more markets, and so, I think it's only going to grow. Now, in addition to the iPhone 5 coming out, one thing that might spur on more iPhone sales are discounts. And Cult of Mac has an interesting little article out about how AT&T is offering iPhone 3GSs for just 1 cent, if you sign up to a plan and an agreement. Now, apparently these are refurbished 3GSs that might have a little blemish here or there. Refurbished means they were returned. But hey, if you're, desperate to get an iPhone and don't have a lot of money, and you are already on some sort of plan with AT&T, maybe get the iPhone. And if you really want to budget it, the way to do it is, right now, the data plans that come with the iPhone with AT&T are either $15, but I think you get like very little data, like 250 megabytes, and something like 2 gigabytes a month for $25. And if you're in a real budget, maybe what you do is get the $15 one and shut off the data. And you can go into your general settings on your iPhone, and you can shut off cell phone data connection. And that's a sure way to stay under the little cap that they give you. But I think that's going to really, spur on sales. I mean, what the real cost to these iPhones are really the long-term cell phone plans. I think it's crazy that we're paying for the phone calls, $50, $60 a month. And on top of that, we're paying $30 a month for unlimited data. Because if you think about it, your phone call is going over the data. And I would like to see one day to have something like an iPod Touch with 3G in it. I hope that comes out in the summer. Because if the plan is similar to the iPad, the 3G data for the iPod Touch will be just $25 a month. And you can turn that into a phone. There are programs now that, will turn your non-phone 3G device, like an iPad, into a phone. And, I think, that's one way to cut costs. I could see doing that at some point. Which is abandoning the iPhone and getting an iPod Touch with 3G data in it. So, anyways, this 1 cent iPhone 3GS plan from AT&T, I think, is going to spur on sales because a lot of people, it's psychological. It's they don't want to lay out any money for the phone when they sign up for the plan. So, I bet you AT&T sells a lot of those 1-cent iPhones. Okay, so one of the more interesting rumors floating around today, and I guess yesterday, is that Apple may be interested in acquiring Barnes & Noble. And from a financial point of view, that is very feasible because Apple has, like I said before, $76 billion in the piggy bank in terms of cash, in other words, savings. And, Apple could probably get Barnes & Noble for a price of between $1 billion to $1.5 billion. So that's really nothing in terms of Apple's stockpile. Apple doesn't even have to borrow any money. So a lot of people are skeptical of that. Now, why would Apple buy Barnes & Noble? Well, I think there's two reasons why it might make sense. One is that, Apple has sort of is in competition with Amazon, which is the big online bookseller. And Apple's iBookstore really doesn't have a lot of products. And now Amazon has to conform with its Kindle app to Apple's rules regarding you can't, if you're going to have an app that sells book or subscribes to books, if you're going to sell it through the book, you have to give Apple 30%. And if you don't sell it through the book, you can't have a link directly to the website to buy the book. So the Kindle app isn't going to be allowed to do that, and who knows, maybe Amazon will one day actually pull the Kindle and the Kindle app from the iPhone or the iPad, and that's a strategic risk because think about it. A lot of people buy the iPad because they also like to read. They like to have movies and like all that. But the Kindle app is probably the #1 ebook reading app or device in the country. And Apple's at risk, having this sort of bizarre partnership with Amazon because Amazon also could be, competing with Apple and making these devices like the tablet devices. There's already a rumor of a colored Kindle coming on board in the coming year. So what if Apple booted, or what if Amazon pulled its Kindle app from the iPad? Wouldn't Apple be at a risk? Well, maybe by buying Barnes & Noble, Apple can reinvigorate Barnes & Noble and ensure that Apple has a steady stream of ebooks to the iPad. Apple would also then have a cheap ebook because you have the Nook, right? I think that's Barnes & Noble's electronic device. Apple could make the Nook better and could make it a better e-reader, and Apple could then have sort of like, if you compare it to the iPod, what happened with the iPod, you had regular iPods and then you had the cheap nano iPod. So maybe the Nook would then become like the very cheap e-reading device from Apple. Apple could do a better job with that device, plus all the content. So you know what? Although a lot of people are skeptical about Apple buying Barnes & Noble, I could see it happening because, one, it would secure content for Apple, and two, would get this cheap device. Maybe there's a third reason. Barnes & Noble has a lot of real estate and property throughout the country. Apple would get access to all that real estate and could sell Apple devices in the Barnes & Noble, but maybe Apple has the ability to reinvent the book selling. Because I was thinking, what would be really cool? It'd be really cool if you could go to a bookstore and buy an ebook there by also looking at the real book, and maybe do a deal where you get both the ebook and the real book. And I think people still want that place to hang out and read. And it only costs $1 billion for Barnes & Noble. So I don't know, a lot of people are skeptical, but I think it might make sense for Apple to be bold and take Barnes & Noble, because it would be insurance to get content for, the iBookstore. It would also allow Apple to compete on the low end with the e-reading devices against the Kindle with the Nook. And also Apple would get access to a lot of real estate because Barnes & Noble has a lot of valuable leases throughout the country. And Apple, would just have more places that it can sell Apple products. So I don't know. I'm actually thinking it might be a good fit. Okay, so one of the most interesting articles I read this week comes from Patently Apple, which had an article entitled Apple Reinvents How 3D Displays Could One Day Deliver Content. And it's very interesting because apparently Apple has a 3D patent that Patently Apple found, and it's really for a new way to do 3D on TV or displays. And the basic concept that Apple has in the patent is that there would be 3 or 4 panels, LED panels or display panels, very closely together in a display, and they could be manipulated maybe to move a little closer apart, a little farther apart, which would then make the image appear like depth to the human eye. And also, there's all sorts of manipulation that could be done with different LED lighting, and it would all be controlled by like powerful GPUs, graphic processors, or the like. And it's all very interesting. The inventor is Peter Mahewald, and basically the patent basically says there could be also very interesting things done with this technology. An example would be 3D desktop background, where the background image may be an unmoving JPEG image or other embodiment and include video clip or animation, and the background image may be split into separate elements and displayed across the various panels of the display. And it goes on to say, for example, if the background image shows a tree and a bird in flight, the bird and tree may be defined as separate elements. The bird may then be displayed on the front or middle panel, while the tree is shown on the rear panel. In this manner, 3-dimensionality of the background image may likewise be achieved or simulated. So, it sounds very interesting, this technology, but it got me thinking, which is, a lot of people have been speculating that Apple is one day going to enter the TV world and TV competition. And this article by Patently Apple has gotten me thinking, if Apple ever did that, ever entered the highly competitive TV market, it would do so with a splash, and it would do so by trying to capture the higher end of the TV market and where it can get higher margins. Because one of the reasons I think Apple will not enter just regular TV market is the margins are terrible. In other words, the profit that companies make on LCDs and plasma TVs are very small because of competition. They're all alike. The profits have been falling. You can go to Costco and pick up a 40-inch or 42-inch TV for like $500-600. So there's lots of competition. But remember, Apple is famous for studying some market, at coming in and reinventing it by making it much better, so much better that the competition is left in the dust. And Apple did that with the iPod because there were MP3s. There were lots of MP3s. But Apple raised it strategically, big time by being the first one that really had a beautiful MP3 player that had a hard drive in it. There was one, but it was clumsy. Now, here's the problem with current TVs, which is, they're marketing 3D TVs, but the 3D TVs now suck. They give people a headache. You have to wear special expensive glasses, and the glasses are not compatible with other models. Well, what if Apple developed a really fantastic 3D technology that was really like leagues above the 3D technology that exists now, and it didn't require any glasses, and it was also something that could be used with computer displays and not just TV displays. If Apple comes out and nobody else has this technology, and that would be strategically killer. If they could come out with a 3D that was much more lifelike, much more interesting, and the key is no glasses. If you could just use it, people would pay a premium for that. People would pay, 50% or 100% more than they would pay for the same type of TV that's regular, if it really was this compelling. And Apple would always enter in the high end of the market where there is greater margins. Now, patently, Apple points out that Apple has experience with 3D, particularly Steve Jobs, because Steve Jobs founded Pixar, and Pixar relied on 3D technology to create that animation, and Steve Jobs built Pixar into a powerhouse in animation, 3D animation, and it was ultimately sold to Disney. So, and it's funny because I was thinking for a long time, why would Apple ever get into the TV market? You know, sure, it has the internet connection through the Apple TV, and it would make sense to put that into a monitor. But if Apple really wants the big margins, Apple has to come up with technology that blows people away, and that's better than the current TVs. And the holy grail, I think, is to make a really beautiful, compelling, lifelike, non-headache-making 3D for television that does not require glasses. So I think this patently Apple article is onto something and should be checked out. It's a very interesting article. You should check it out. Now, earlier this week, I had a profound thought, you know, and it concerns the iPhone and Android, or iPhone and iPad and iOS devices against Android. And for a long time, as an Apple investor, I was always a little frustrated that, you know, Android was, in terms of the number of devices out there, that was beating, you know, the iPhone, just in terms of the raw numbers. Apple's making all the profit with the iPhone, but there are a lot of cheap Android devices out. But then it hit me. It hit me that actually Android is helping Apple. So I wrote this post, which I think makes sense. And here's what I said. I said, many people believe that Steve Jobs is furious at Google for releasing Android and copying the iPhone. And for a long time, as an Apple fan and longtime investor, I was pissed at Google for copying Android. Disclosure, I'm also a Google investor. But I recently came to the realization that Android is doing Apple a big favor. And what could that be? Android is helping Apple fend off Microsoft and RIM or anyone else from entering the smartphone and tablet market. When Google created Android and gave it to device manufacturers for free, yes, it may have hurt Apple a bit. After all, Apple revolutionized smartphones by creating the iPhone in 2007. Android phones, to some extent, cut into iPhone sales. But the real damage Android has made is to Apple's other potential competitors, Microsoft, RIM, and Nokia. By giving Android away for free, Google has undermined Microsoft's traditional partners that made hardware to go with Microsoft software. Motorola, Samsung, HTC, and others are all coming out with Android devices, and that is all at the expense of Windows Mobile. Also, the Android onslaught has helped destroy RIM and Nokia. So how is this helping Apple? Well, it's helping Apple because Android sales are mainly coming at the expense of Microsoft, RIM, and Nokia, and not Apple. Android is given away for free, so it is mainly being used in smartphones, which can sell very cheaply with carrier plans, significantly under the $200 that a new iPhone cost with the plan. Microsoft, RIM, and Nokia dominated those markets, but Android has decimated that lower end of the smartphone, feature phone market. What would have been more dangerous for Apple in the long run would have been any of these options. One, Microsoft, RIM, or Nokia successfully competing against the iPhone, or two, a free Android operating system flooding the bottom of the smartphone market. The first scenario would have been much worse for Apple. Had Microsoft succeeded in the smartphone market in the wake of the iPhone, Microsoft could have posed a threat to Apple by leveraging its PC dominance and having Microsoft smartphones dominate the enterprise. Similarly, success by RIM or Nokia posed a bigger threat to Apple than free Android. The reality is that when Apple released the iPhone, Apple did not have the resources or agreements in place to deliver the iPhone to everywhere. In fact, by necessity, Apple by contract could only sell the iPhone in the United States on the AT&T network. Free Android on Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint actually served Apple. First, it helped undermine the traditional powers in those markets, Microsoft, RIM, and Nokia. Second, it exposed customers in those markets to the joy of touch computing before any iPhone or iPad was available there. Many customers on those networks had no ability to really switch to AT&T. Free Android gave those customers a taste of something iPhone-like, priming them to eventually become iPhone or iPad customers. Third, by using the free OS model, Google helped Apple by preventing any other hardware manufacturer from having a dominant second position to Apple's #1 smartphone hardware position. Free Android essentially diffused the power of touch handsets for those other than Apple. Many hardware manufacturers can make Android devices as the operating system is free. While this may be a strength for Google, it is actually a weakness for the hardware manufacturers. Finally, not having exclusivity over the OS prevents manufacturers like Samsung from innovating and making a better smartphone than the iPad. All Samsung can do is make better raw hardware components, like adding more camera pixels or increasing processor power. But Apple has shown through devices like the iPhone and MacBook Air that the ability to make both the hardware and software results in a crisper and more premium product. Android hardware manufacturers face constant competition on price from other Android hardware manufacturers. This results in pressure on price and margins and a race to the bottom. Google, with free Android, has made it possible for Apple to capture the upper end of the smartphone and tablet markets while not having to worry that any hardware manufacturer or its old nemesis MSFT will capture any significant portion of that market. Okay, so the other interesting thing that happened this week is that Apple, for the first time, hit $400 per share during normal trading hours. This was the highest stock price ever for Apple. And it had done it before in after hours, but this week it actually hit $400. This was 3 days ago. And but I think Apple is still, to a large degree, not an expensive stock. And disclaimer, I'm an Apple stock owner, and this is not a stock recommendation. But Apple's price-earnings ratio is something like, like $15 or something like that. And yeah, it's $15.47, and that's pretty low. And on top of that, if you think about it, Apple has huge $76 billion worth of cash saved up, which comes to like $80 a share. So look, if the stock is trading right now, today it's trading, because the whole market's down, at $390 a share. Well, if you could buy the whole company at $390 a share, you'd get back $80 a share because of the cash. So really, you could buy the company for $300 a share if you were taking over the whole company. Well, that makes the PE ratio, the price of the stock compared to the earnings, even lower. So, a lot of analysts say Apple has plenty of room to growth, and to some extent, because the stock price is so high, people are not really seeing that the real price is the price-earnings ratio and what its room for growth is. It's still a relatively cheap stock. Now, to give you a comparison, the market celebrated Amazon's earnings results, but look at Amazon. Its price-earnings ratio is $96.43. So the price of the stock as a ratio to the earnings is much higher than Apple's. And the thing that really just frustrates me about Amazon is that Amazon's profit is hardly anything compared to Apple's. Apple makes margin when it sells something, it makes like 30 to 40 cents for every dollar. But Amazon, has like a margin of like 2% or so. So, people celebrate Amazon's revenue growing, but its profits aren't growing, its revenue is. Now, what kind of business is that? So I think it's unfair for people to compare Apple to Amazon. Actually, my view is that Apple is much more successful than Amazon. I mean, if you go to its financial results, Amazon's profit margin is 2.85%. let's take a look at Apple's profit margin, and it's let's see, it's Apple's profit margin is 23.53%. So in my opinion, there's no comparison. Apple's a much stronger and healthier company. Okay, so one of the interesting stories this week was in the New York Times about Apple, and the story highlighted how successful Apple is in China. And the story points out that the 2 stores in Shanghai, which only, I guess, opened up in the last year or so, which are massive, they can't handle the demand, and they're overrun with long lines. And apparently Apple is going to open a 3rd store in Shanghai, and the article points out that these stores are even outselling Apple's 5th Avenue store in New York City, which is Apple's most profitable store in the United States. Now, I visited Shanghai last June before Apple opened its stores in that city, and I could tell during my trip that Apple products were in high demand. As I walked the city, people would approach me and offer to sell me an iPhone. I also visited electronics buildings, which were filled with small kiosks and businesses selling electronic products. In those electronic bazaars, the most popular devices being sold were iPhones, iPads, and iPod Touches. The second most popular devices in that electronic bazaar were clones and knockoffs of Apple products. I expect Apple's growth in China will continue. Apple may still have hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. China may have hundreds of millions of people living in poverty, but it has wealth and middle-class people. While those 2 classes may be a small percentage of the population is so large, over 1 billion, that the number of wealth and middle class is pretty massive. As such, Apple has a very large pool of customers and potential customers to sell to in China. So, I expect you're going to see Apple continuing to grow in Asia. Okay, so why don't we end up this podcast with some tips regarding Lion. Now, one of the cool things in Lion is you have this reading list part of Safari. Now, what that is are these pair of eyeglasses that you see an icon to the left of your collections and of bookmarks and such. So if you click that, you can add links to that, and you can unclick it and it closes the sidebar. But here's a handy little tip, and I think it was Andy Anatko. If you go to a link, here I'm at macnn.com. If you go to a link, and when you're over a link, if you want to quickly add that to the reading list, you press the Shift key down and then click, and there'll be a little animation. You'll see like this flying link go up to the reading list. I'll do it again. You can see that animation, and if you go to the reading list, it's there. The other way to do it is just have the sidebar over, and when you're on a link that you like, you click Add Page, and that will do it. Actually, I already have that page, so I can't click that. So that's one tip in Lion. Okay, so here's another tip in Lion. In Lion, you don't have in the sidebar anymore an icon of your hard drive. You have if you have other hard drives connected, you will have them listed under Devices at the bottom. But you no longer have your main hard drive where your operating system is. So, but you can get it there. It's not that hard. People are complaining about it. So here's the thing. You will have icons like desktop, right? So click on desktop, and at the bottom, make sure you have visible the path bar. See, if you go under view, if you hide the path bar, you can't see it. But click show path bar, and that'll show that the desktop's part of your user home folder, but ultimately the Macintosh HD icon is there. So you go down there and you grab onto it and you just drag it to the sidebar. Whoops, I didn't put it in the right place. Let me try it again. And there you go. There it is. So you have your hard drive icon there. So that's another tip. Okay, so here's another Lion tip, which is that Lion now has the dictionary built into the OS, so any app can now take advantage of the dictionary. It's built in, and it's very easy to do if you have a touchpad, and you will if you have a MacBook Air or MacBook Pro. So you just go to a word, and using 3 fingers, you tap twice on the word. There we go. So the word keyboard there popped up, and there's the dictionary. It's got a thesaurus and everything, and then you just click again and it disappears. Here, I'll click somewhere else. I'll click on computer, tap twice with my 3 fingers. The word computer is in yellow. The dictionary comes up. So that's a pretty cool way to do things, and you know, you should check it out. That's a very cool Lion tip. Okay, so that's it for the Apple podcast. This is episode 82. I'm going to call it the MacBook Air episode, and today is July 29, 2011. If you want an invite to Google+, just email MacsFuture@gmail.com, and I'll send you an invitation. And again, this is a podcast about Apple-related stuff, and we'd appreciate any positive feedback you could give in the Apple Store or anywhere else. So thanks for listening.